Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm Mark Rozelle. I serve as Dean of the Schar School of Policy and Government here at George Mason University. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this very special event tonight with our colleague, distinguished visiting professor, Bill Bolling, who's going to be talking about the rise and fall of the Republican Party in Virginia. Bill Bolling, as many of you know, has had a very distinguished career in public service in Virginia. At the age of 34 in 1991, he was elected to serve as a member and chairman of the Hanover County Board of Supervisors. And then he was elected to the Senate of Virginia in 1995 at the age of 38, and he served there for 10 years. In 2005, Mr. Bolling was elected as the 39th Lieutenant Governor of Virginia, and he was reelected to that office 4 years later. And that was the last time a Republican won a statewide political campaign in Virginia. Mr. Bolling has the distinction of serving as Lieutenant Governor with a Democratic governor, Tim Kaine, and also a Republican governor, Bob McDonnell. He is widely recognized for his ability to work with people of different political parties and ideologies to get things done. Following his service as Lieutenant Governor, he returned to his career as an insurance executive in Richmond, but he has always had a passion for teaching young people about government and politics. So in the fall of 2018, he left his career in the insurance industry to accept an appointment as a senior fellow at James Madison University, where he did guest lecturing in government politics and leadership for 3 semesters. And in the spring of 2020, I'm delighted Mr. Bolling joined the faculty of the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University as a visiting professor, where he has taught courses on state and local government and also political parties and campaigns. Over the past 2 years, Mr. Bolling has also taught at Virginia Commonwealth University and at the University of Richmond. Mr. Bolling is married to his wife of 43 years, Jean Ann, and the Bollings have 2 adult sons, Matt, who graduated from Virginia Tech in 2006, and Kevin, who graduated from James Madison University in 2010. Bill and Jean Ann, live in Mechanicsville, a northern suburb of the city of Richmond. So I'm very much looking forward to this. And actually, Bill Bolling was nice enough to share a draft of his presentation ahead of time for me to look at it. And I know you're in for a great treat tonight. I myself committed many months ago to be the speaker at my undergraduate college's Alumni Association event on this exact evening. So I apologize for not being here for the entire program, but I'm going to stay for part of it. And I've seen it all. You're in for a treat. So I now turn the program over to my colleague, former Lieutenant Governor Bill Bolling. Bill?
Well, thank you, Mark, and good evening, everybody. Let me echo Mark's comments in thanking you for joining us tonight for this public lecture, kind of a discussion of contemporary Virginia politics. A lecture that I started out calling From Blue to Red and Back Again, and then subtitled The Rise and Fall of the GOP in Virginia. And I think we'll see how that subtitle has become a part of this lecture as we go through our conversation tonight. I want to also thank Mark Rozelle for being here this evening and doing that introduction. That was very kind, Mark, and I appreciate that very much. I have enjoyed greatly the partnership that I've had with the Schar School over the course of the past couple of years. George Mason is one of Virginia's great universities, and a lot of our universities have great schools of government and policy, but I'll tell you, I've come to honestly believe that the Schar School probably does this better than any of the other universities in the state. So Mark, again, thank you for letting me be a part of George Mason, but also for being here tonight and participating in the opening of this public lecture.
Thank you, Bill. We appreciate it. We're delighted to have you.
Well, I thought I'd go over just a couple of things tonight before we kind of get into the nuts and bolts of the topic that we're going to be talking about. We're going to break this lecture tonight up into really 3 different parts. For about the next hour, I am going to share with you some thoughts around a couple of issues. The first being an overview of the political evolution that's taken place in Virginia over the past 50 to 70 years. And then that'll take about 30 minutes. And then the second part, which will also take about 30 minutes, is more a discussion of the factors that have impacted the recent decline of the GOP in Virginia over the course of the past decade or so. So that'll probably all take us to about the top of the hour. And then we'll have some opportunity for questions and answers after that, and try to wrap up about 8:30 tonight. I know a lot of you will want to listen to President Biden's address to Congress, which comes on at 9 o'clock tonight. So we want to make sure we get everything wrapped up well before then. Also, we'll say a word about how you can submit questions and answers. On your Zoom feed, you'll find a connection for question and answers. So as we go through the presentation tonight, if you do have questions or comments that you'd like to share, I invite you to put those in that question and answer queue. And then when we're finished with the formal presentation this evening, we'll take 30 minutes or so to go through some of those questions and answers before we adjourn tonight. I want to assure you that having spent 22 years in public life, I take constructive criticism well. So don't feel that you have to agree with me on everything. I assure you that when I was in public life, people didn't agree with me on everything. And today in the classroom, students don't always agree with me on everything. And it is through that exchange of ideas, I think, that we learn and that we mature and that we grow. So if you do have questions or comments, I invite you to share them through that question and answer feature. And if for some reason your question doesn't get answered, or you have a comment you'd like to share with me offline, I've also included my email there at George Mason, just wbowling@gmu.edu. And I invite you to use that as well. And I'll try to respond to as many of those comments as I can. And then perhaps just one last disclaimer. Those of you who know anything about me know that I served 22 years in public office in Virginia as a Republican. It is important to note that while I certainly still have a conservative political ideology, I no longer consider myself to be a partisan. I'm not a member of any active Republican Party organizations, nor am I a member of any active Democratic Party organizations. I have friends on both sides of the political aisle. And in my role these days of trying to educate and spur thought around issues of politics and policy, I sometimes consider myself an equal opportunity offender. So I'm sure there'll be things that I say tonight that my Republican friends may take exception to. I'm sure there are things I'll say tonight that my Democratic friends may take exception to. That's okay. One of the things that I think we can all benefit from is again, that exchange of ideas in constructive conversation. So with just a few introductory comments out of the way, let's jump in to the heart of our conversation tonight, from blue to red and back again, the rise and fall of the GOP in Virginia. I want to start by just noting that Virginia's political environment, the current political environment that we're all familiar with today, has evolved over time. And in unlike probably any other state in the nation, the evolution, or some might believe the devolution, of our political environment has been influenced heavily by Virginia's unique history and by the important figures and events that have shaped that history. And we'll talk about some of those things tonight. The truth is that no state in the nation can compare to Virginia in terms of the historical impact that our state has had on our country. After all, America started right here in Virginia with the founding of this new world in 1607 at Jamestown. For the first 5 presidents of our nation, once we won independence, were Virginians. Much of the Revolutionary War, much of the Civil War was fought right here in Virginia. So our state has a unique history, a lot of unique people in that history. Parts of that history that we certainly are proud of as Virginians, parts of that history that we wish had been handled differently by those who came before us. But all of that has gone into creating the current political environment that in life that we have. in Virginia today. It's also important to note that despite all of Virginia's diversity over time and historical impact on the nation over time, the Old Dominion's political culture was really very monolithic up until the 1950s, 1960s, and more on a state basis, really into the 1970s. And Virginia's political culture was dominated by Democrats, and Republicans played very much of a secondary or a backbench role in Virginia's political culture. Let's look at some statistics that kind of prove that point. From 1791 through 1970, there were 50 Democrats who were elected to serve as governor of Virginia, and that includes a couple of the folks back when right after the Constitution was first ratified that served as Democratic Republicans, and of course the Democratic Republican Party evolved into the Democratic Party. There were only 9 Republicans who served during that same period of time. And that included a couple governors who served as Federalists and a couple as Whigs, which ultimately evolved into the Republican Party. But you can see that on a statewide basis, when it came to the office of governor of Virginia during that period, 1791 to 1970, it was solidly dominated by Democrats. And leading up to the election of Linwood Holton, the first Republican governor in Virginia in almost 100 years, Democrats had consistently held the office of governor ever since Reconstruction. So if you just look at the number of people who served as governor of Virginia, both Democrats and Republicans, you know, it's a pretty clear indicator that Virginia's political culture was dominated during this period of time by Democrats. If you look at Virginia's representation in the United States Senate during that same period of time, you see much the same thing. 35 different Democrats represented Virginia in the United States Senate during that period. Only 3 Republicans represented Virginia in the United States Senate. In fact, 2 of those were Whigs before the Republican Party came to be, and then only 1 actual Republican. Now, there were a few other senators during that period of time that represented some other parties, the Jacksonian Party, the anti-Jacksonian Party, the Unionist Party, the Readjuster Party. But when we think about politics today, we think about it in terms of twos, Republicans and Democrats for the most part. And during that period of time, 35 Democrats represented Virginia in the United States Senate. Only 3 Republicans represented Virginia in the United States Senate. At the state legislative level, it even took longer for Republicans to gain a foothold in Virginia's, a strong foothold in Virginia's political culture. The first Republican majority in the General Assembly of Virginia did not occur until 1998. Democrats had controlled the General Assembly every year before that time. Again, you can see here, Virginia was clearly a Democratic state, with Republicans playing a token role in state government during most of the Commonwealth's history, and certainly during most of the Commonwealth's history in that period post-Reconstruction, following the end of the Civil War. But it is important to note that these were not your modern Democrats. They were a very conservative group of Democrats in the true Southern tradition. A great deal of their focus was placed on fiscal conservatism. They believed very strongly in a pay-as-you-go method, keeping government small and focused on its core responsibilities and paying for things as you went. They would be repulsed by the idea of deficit spending or debt that both parties seem to have a taste for these days. And they were also the ones who advocated for Jim Crow laws following the end of Reconstruction, and particularly here in Virginia, a massive resistance following the Supreme Court's order of integration of public schools massive resistance here in Virginia, which resulted in a continuation of segregation and even a shutdown of the public school system in Virginia, right up until the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in 1965. So this was a very different ideological makeup of the Democratic Party that controlled Virginia for all of this period of time when compared with more moderate Democrats. These were the old Byrd Democrats. They were the followers of Senator Harry F. Byrd, who was a former Virginia governor and a U.S. senator. And it was during most of this period of time in the 20th century that Senator Byrd's Byrd machine dominated and controlled Virginia politics. Harry Byrd was obviously an interesting fellow. He was a newspaper publisher from Winchester, Virginia. He was elected in 1926 as the youngest governor of Virginia at the age of 38 years old. And he then was the longest serving U.S. senator in the history of Virginia, serving for 32 years from 1933 to 1965. And again, he was the patriarch of this powerful Byrd machine. There were a lot of these political machines back in the, around the turn of the century in the early 1900s that you've probably studied as you've studied politics over the years. But in Virginia, it was this Byrd machine that really controlled, really dominated Virginia politics. If you wanted to run as a Democrat on a statewide basis in Virginia, you did that with the blessing of Harry Byrd. If you wanted to run for the state legislature or even for local office in Virginia during this period of time, you did that with the blessing of the political or the party leaders that Byrd controlled in every county and city across Virginia. Harry Byrd ruled the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party controlled Virginia politics, as we'll see, really up until the 1950s, the 1970s, and then in legislative races, again, more really into the 1990s. Here are a couple interesting quotes about Harry Byrd's Virginia that I always find informative. One of them from an author by the name of V.O. Key Jr., who in 1949 wrote, "Of all the American states, Virginia," he said, "can lay claim to the most thorough control by an oligarchy. Political power has been closely held by a small group of leaders who themselves and their predecessors have subverted," he said, "democratic institutions and deprived most Virginians of their voice in government. It is a political museum piece." Years later, Frank Atkinson, a dear friend of mine who many of you probably know, an attorney practicing here in Richmond, wrote a book called The Dynamic Dominion. And in Frank's book, The Dynamic Dominion, he picked up on V.O. Key's reference to the Byrd machine as this political museum piece. And Frank Atkinson wrote these words. He said, "Well, if Virginia was a political museum piece, Senator Byrd was both sculptor and curator. So complete was his control and so pervasive his influence that observers seldom referred to the Democratic Party as anything other than the Byrd organization." So this is the Democratic Party that controlled Virginia politics really from that period post-Reconstruction, again, right up until the election of Linwood Holton as governor of Virginia in 1969. Now, ultimately, Harry Byrd retired from the U.S. Senate in 1965. His seat was handed down to his son, Harry F. Byrd Jr. And as I've referred to or alluded to a couple of times, it really wasn't until the election of a Republican governor in 1969, for the first time in the 20th century, that this 80 years of domination of Virginia politics by these conservative Southern Democrats came to an end. If you look back a little bit, we started, however, seeing the beginnings of kind of the change in Virginia's political landscape from blue to red. We started seeing the beginning of those changes maybe as early as the presidential election of 1952. In the period 1872, and we use that because that's the post-Reconstruction going forward, Reconstruction going forward period. In the period 1872 to 1948, there had been 19 presidential campaigns in Virginia. Democrats had won 18 of those presidential campaigns in Virginia. Republicans carried Virginia only once. That was Herbert Hoover in 1928, which Virginians probably soon regretted because fairly or unfairly, of course, it was Hoover who got most of the blame for the Great Depression that hit in 1929. But starting in 1952 through 2004, there were 14 presidential campaigns in Virginia, and Republicans won 13 of those presidential elections. In fact, the only Democrat that carried Virginia during that period of time was Lyndon Johnson, who carried Virginia in the presidential campaign of 1964. So one might obviously look at that and say, well, what was it that changed in 1952 that started this pendulum maybe moving from Democratic control to Republicans becoming more competitive, and at least these statewide campaigns of national implication, presidential campaigns? Well, what happened was Harry Byrd. In 1952, Senator Byrd announced that he would not support a candidate for president, saying that, quote, silence is golden. And that was a signal to Virginia Democrats that it was okay to vote for the Republican nominee, Dwight Eisenhower, as opposed to the Democratic nominee, who Byrd did not like, Adlai Stevenson. That division that came about in 1952 was in large part due to the movement of the Democratic Party away from the segregationist policies that Byrd and his supporters had long championed. That move in the Democratic Party really started with the second term of Harry Truman, and by the time the 1952 campaign came about, it was in full swing. It was something that Byrd just simply wasn't comfortable with, and he decided that although he wasn't prepared to endorse the Republican Dwight Eisenhower, he wasn't at all comfortable endorsing the Democrat Adlai Stevenson, and with a wink and a nod, Senator Byrd basically gave these Virginia Democrats permission to go out and support Dwight Eisenhower in the presidential election of 1952. Indeed, they did. And over time, Virginia Democrats continued to move more and more to Republican candidates in these national political campaigns. And a lot of that, again, was driven by a couple of things. One was this continuing movement of the Democratic Party away from these segregationist policies that Byrd had championed in the South, and the other was the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and the Great Society program in the 1960s, which Byrd took great exception to because it, again, represented a move away from the segregationist policies of the South, but also because it represented a tremendous expansion in the role and growth of government, particularly as reflected by the Great Society programs. So steadily during this period of time, these old Southern Democrats started voting for Republicans in national political campaigns, and more increasingly in state-based campaigns as well. If you're at all interested in this whole evolution of the Democratic Party in Virginia, this blue to red that we're about to talk about, and in particular the role that Senator Byrd played in that, here's an article that you might find interesting. You can Google it at the Virginia Magazine of History and Biography. It's an article written by James Sweeney, who was a professor of political science at Old Dominion University, called Whispers in the Golden Silence, Harry Byrd, John Kennedy, and Virginia Democrats in the 1960 presidential election. But Professor Sweeney in this article spends a lot of time talking not just about what happened in 1960, but what led up to that in 1956 and in 1952. So I lift that up for your reading. It's a very interesting and informative historical article that I think you might enjoy. Well, in state-based political campaigns, this evolution from blue to red really didn't start happening until about 20 years later. in about 1970. We mentioned before that from 1791 to 1970, there were 50 Democratic governors in Virginia. And during that same period of time, there were only 9 Republican governors in Virginia. But starting with the election of Linwood Holton in 1969, he took office in 1970. Since 1970, there have been 6 Republican governors and 7 Democratic governors in Virginia, a much more competitive period for the Republican Party in these statewide executive office political campaigns. This is just a list of some of those governors. And the evolution has been interesting. From 1970 through 1982, we had 3 consecutive Republican governors: Linwood Holton, Mills Godwin, and John Dalton. Godwin, obviously an interesting figure who had served a first term as governor as a Democrat, and then came back in 1974, elected to a second term as governor as a Republican. And then in 1982 through 1994, we had 3 consecutive Democratic governors: Chuck Robb, Gerald Baliles, and Doug Wilder, followed by 2 more Republican governors, George Allen and Jim Gilmore, followed by 2 more Democratic governors, Mark Warner and Tim Kaine, followed by yet another Republican governor, Bob McDonnell, elected in 2009, serving from 2010 to 14. And then, of course, our last 2 governors have been Democrats, Terry McAuliffe and Ralph Northam. I highlighted them because the question becomes, will this trend of shifting power between Republicans and Democrats in the executive office in Virginia, will it continue? Will that pendulum swing back perhaps to Republicans now that we've had 2 consecutive Democratic governors, or will we see a continuation of Democratic control of the executive office of governor? And I think that we'll learn more about that perhaps as we get into the second part of our time together tonight. We've also seen this evolution in the way that Virginia has voted for United States senators. We mentioned before that from 1791 to 1972, Virginia elected 35 Democratic senators, only 3 Republican senators. But since 1972, Virginia has elected 4 Democratic senators and 4 Republican senators. Again, much more competitive in these top of the ticket campaigns for the U.S. Senate in Virginia. And here's a list of those senators. The beginning of the Republican senators: William Scott, who served for 1 term from 1973 to 1979. John Warner, who served from 1979 to 2009. Paul Tribble, who served a term from 1983 to 1989. And of course, George Allen, who served from 2001 to 2007. And then the 4 Democrats that you'll see there: Chuck Robb, who served from 1989 through 2001. Jim Webb, who defeated George Allen in 2007 and served 1 term through 2013. And then, of course, our 2 current Democratic United States Senators, Mark Warner and Tim Kaine. And I highlight Jim Webb, Mark Warner, and Tim Kaine because the same question comes up. Will Virginia remain competitive when it comes to electing U.S. senators, as we had been in that period from 1972 on, or will this be a trend? You know, the last 3 U.S. senators elected in Virginia have been Democrats: Jim Webb, Mark Warner, and Tim Kaine. Will that trend continue? And again, we may get some perspective on that as we get into looking at some of the changes that have taken place in Virginia, particularly over the course of the past decade or so. We saw the same changes in Virginia's representation in the U.S. House of Representatives. Interestingly, from 1933 to 1953, Virginia's 9 congressional districts were 100% occupied by Democrats. There wasn't a single Republican who represented Virginia in the House of Representatives. The first Republicans in more than 20 years in Virginia were elected to Virginia's congressional delegation in 1953. Remember, 1952, Harry Byrd winking a nod. It's okay to go out and vote for some of these Republicans. Richard Poff was elected in the 6th District of Virginia, William Wampler in the 9th District of Virginia. But we all know over the course of time, as the pendulum moved from blue to red, by 2011, Republicans had taken solid control of Virginia's congressional delegation. At one point, 8 Republicans and only 3 Democrats. So we saw Virginia becoming very Republican, very red during this period of time in presidential campaigns. We saw it becoming very competitive in top of the ticket statewide campaigns for governor in the U.S. Senate. We saw it become very red in the makeup of Virginia's congressional delegation. It is important to note, I think, that these Republicans who brought about this renaissance for the Republican Party in the 1970s and on were something called Mountain Valley Republicans. They were center-right conservatives. They were fiscal conservatives. They were pro-business conservatives. They were very much focused on what I call kitchen table issues, issues that really mattered to families. They were largely supporters of civil rights reforms. They were great believers in the idea of bipartisanship. They were very pragmatic in their approach to politics and policy. They were called Mountain Valley Republicans. I mention that simply to say that there is a great model here for what I believe the Republican Party needs to look like in the future if it is going to be able to regain its footing in Virginia. It may need to get back to this model of Mountain Valley Republicans. And that's something that I would ask that you focus on a little bit, learn a little bit more about how Mountain Valley Republicans may have differed a little bit in their makeup and the issues that they focus on and the approach that they took to politics and policy from perhaps today's Republicans. It could be said that today's Democrats are unlike yesterday's Democrats. Today's Republicans are also unlike yesterday's Republicans. Well, at the state level, it took a little longer for Virginia to become competitive and for Republicans to take control, but that did indeed happen. Prior to the 1990s, Democrats had controlled both houses of the Virginia General Assembly since Reconstruction, solid Democratic control. But Republicans achieved parity in the state Senate in 1996. I remember that election well. I was the 20th Republican elected in 1996, which gave Republicans parity with the Democrats for the first time since Reconstruction. And then it was 2 years later that Republicans won their first majority in the Senate of Virginia. And since that time in 1996, by the way, Republicans controlled the Senate of Virginia for 17 years, while Democrats have only controlled the Senate of Virginia for 6 years. So again, you can see that pendulum swinging now into the 1990s in the General Assembly makeup from blue to red. And it became even more pronounced in the House of Delegates. Republicans gained control of the House of Delegates in 1999, and they controlled the House of Delegates for 20 consecutive years until, of course, Democrats gained control of the House of Delegates in 2019. So we talk about from blue to red, blue being this domination that Democrats had over Virginia politics from Reconstruction up until at the state level into the 1970s, but then this swing to Republican control that started in the 1950s in presidential campaigns in Virginia, the 1970s, where Republicans became much more competitive in statewide races for governor and for the U.S. Senate. And then, of course, domination of the congressional delegation and capturing majority control in the last decade of the 20th century and the first decade of the 21st century in the General Assembly of Virginia, from blue to red, from Democratic control to relative Republican control. In fact, most political observers in the last decade of the 20th century and the first decade of the 21st century, most political observers felt that Virginia had become a solid Republican state. Think about it. During that period of time, Virginia had 3 Republican governors. Republicans controlled both houses of the Virginia General Assembly. Republicans held both of Virginia's U.S. Senate seats. Republicans occupied at one time 8 of 11 seats in the U.S. House of Representatives, and Republican presidential candidates carried Virginia in every presidential campaign. That is Republican dominance. That is what my Republican friends refer to as the good old days. Well, we know that the good old days are no more. And in light of those kind of statistics and that type of pendulum shift, the question that Republicans have found themselves asking over the course of the past decade, and in particular over the course of the past few years, is what in the world happened? What in the world happened to take this Virginia that had gone from blue to red and seemingly has now pushed it back to blue again? Think about what has happened. Since 2009, Democrats have won 2 statewide campaigns for governor, Terry McAuliffe in 2013, Ralph Northam in 2017. 4 campaigns for the U.S. Senate, Tim Kaine, Mark Warner, Tim Kaine, and Mark Warner again. 4 presidential campaigns, Obama, Clinton, and in 2020, Joe Biden. Republicans have not won a statewide political campaign in Virginia in more than a decade. Here's a sobering fact. In the past decade, Republicans have won more statewide campaigns in Massachusetts and Maryland than they've won in Virginia. And if you are a Virginia Republican and that doesn't make your blood boil, then I don't know what else will, to think that in these top of the ticket campaigns, Republicans are actually doing better in places like Massachusetts and Maryland than they are doing today here in Virginia. And we've seen these shifts in other areas as well. In Virginia's congressional delegation, prior to 2018, 8 Republicans and 3 Democrats. It's now 7 Democrats and 4 Republicans. Republicans in the congressional delegation were defeated broadly in the off-year elections of 2018 and again in 2020. And of course, we've seen these dramatic changes in the last couple of years in the composition of the Virginia General Assembly, to the point that Democrats now control both the Senate of Virginia and the Virginia House of Delegates. And this graph, which I borrow from our friends at VPAP, really tells the story well. If you look down here at the bottom, what has happened, particularly in the last couple of years at the state level, is Democrats have gained control of the governor's office and both houses of the General Assembly for the first time in 30 years. The last time that we had a Democratic governor and Democratic control of both houses of the General Assembly was when Doug Wilder was governor back in 1993, almost 30 years ago. And we have certainly seen the impact that this shift has had on policy in Virginia. Whether you think it's for the better or the worse, certainly the manner in which policy has evolved or devolved over the course of the past couple of years with this Democratic control of the state government apparatus has been remarkable. Democrats, having not controlled all 3 of these areas of state government in more than 30 years, had a lot of catching up to do. There were a lot of Republican policies implemented during this period of time that they wanted to undo. There were a lot of their own policies that they wanted to implement. And there has been a sea change in the policies coming out of the General Assembly in the last couple of years as a result of this dramatic shift from blue to red and clearly back again to more Democratic control. So again, we're left with this question. What in the world happened? How did this change take place? And I want to wrap up tonight for the next, probably 30 minutes or so by talking a little bit, maybe 20 or 30 minutes, talking a little bit about what I think has happened and where Virginia's political landscape stands today. And I'm going to suggest to you 4 things. One could probably break these down in more detail than I'm going to tonight, but I want to talk about 4 things that I think have happened that political observers need to be mindful of as we look at the question, has Virginia gone from Democratic to Republican and to Democratic again? Is this a transient change or is this a permanent change in Virginia's political landscape? Let's talk about some of the things that I think have happened over the course of the past decade or so in Virginia's politics. First of all, we need to understand that Virginia has changed. Virginia has changed a lot over the course of the past 10 to 20 years. Much of this change has been driven by what political scientists call changes in residential mobility patterns. That's a fancy way of saying that more and more of the state's population is concentrated in major urban and suburban centers that have been voting more and more Democratic, and less of the state's population is concentrated in rural centers that have historically voted overwhelmingly for Republicans. There was an old joke told about John Dillinger when he was a famous bank robber in his day, and someone once asked John Dillinger why he robbed the banks, and he said, "That's where the money is." Well, when it comes to politics, winning elections has to do with where the people are, where the population is. And these massive, significant changes in Virginia's residential mobility patterns have certainly influenced the way in which Virginians vote. I find this to be an absolutely dramatic visual. If you look at this map of Virginia, the truth is that today, about 50% of the state's population lives in the orange area, and about 50% of the state's population lives in the green area. These major urban and suburban centers in Northern Virginia, in Metro Richmond, and in Hampton Roads are having an increasingly large impact on how elections turn out in Virginia. It's even more dramatic than this chart. If the fellow who put this chart together back in 2016, Nick Kessler, did it this way because he wanted to show a 50-50 split. But if you look closely at that chart, you'll see that some major urban and suburban centers aren't even included. For example, in the Metro Richmond area, Chesterfield County, a very large suburban county, could easily be included green as opposed to orange. If you did that, you would easily see where, in fact, more than 50% of the state's population lives in the green areas, less than 50% of the state's population lives in the orange areas. Well, let's focus in on some of these green areas and see what's happened with the way that these urban and suburban voters are voting and how their population densities have, in fact, changed. This is just some numbers taken from U.S. Census data in 2000 and 2010 and census projections for 2020, and you can see what's happened here. Tremendous growth, particularly in areas like Loudoun County and Prince William County. Population change is 153% in Loudoun County in the last 20 years, 70% in Prince William County. Significant increases in Chesterfield and Henrico and in Chesapeake. And these are areas, as we'll see on the next slide, that are voting more and more Democratic. Now, we could put up some of the key Republican voting areas, most of which are in rural parts of the state. What we would find with that comparison is that many of these localities, the population is actually declining as opposed to increasing. And if there are a few, like where I live here in Hanover County, where the population is increasing, it's not increasing anywhere near as much as we're seeing increases in these areas that are voting more and more Democratic. And make no mistake, they are voting more and more Democratic. If you look here, I just pulled out the key localities: Fairfax, Loudoun, Prince William, Henrico, Chesterfield, Virginia Beach, and Chesapeake. You'll see here the percentage of the vote that Bob McDonnell received in these localities in the 2009 governor's race versus the percentage of the vote that Ed Gillespie received in these same localities in 2017. Look at the dramatic decline in the Republican voting strength in these key urban and suburban centers. Bob McDonnell, and I'm pleased to say I as well, actually won in 2009 in Fairfax County, in Loudoun County, in Prince William County, won by huge margins in Henrico, Chesterfield, Virginia Beach, and Chesapeake. But fast forward 2 elections later, and look at how dramatically Republican voting strength in these localities had dropped. 20% in Fairfax, Loudoun, and Prince William, almost 20% in Henrico, Chesterfield, and Virginia Beach. These are dramatic changes in voting patterns for Republicans that simply make it impossible for Republicans to win. statewide political campaigns, given the tremendous amount of our population that is now being located in these urban and suburban centers. Republicans will never again win a statewide political campaign in Virginia unless they can change that, unless they can become much more competitive in these key urban and suburban centers. Nowhere do you see this change more clearly than when you look at what's happened to the composition of the Virginia General Assembly, particularly the composition of the Virginia House of Delegates. If you go back to 2015 and just focus now over here on the composition of the Virginia House of Delegates, in 2015, there were 66 Republicans in the Virginia House of Delegates. People thought there'd be a Republican majority in the House of Delegates forever, with 66 Republicans and only 34 Democrats. But look what happened following the election of 2017. There were 51 Republicans and 49 Democrats. In fact, it easily could have been 50-50. If you remember, there was a tie on a House of Delegates seat in the city of Newport News. Republicans ended up winning that seat when they drew from a hat. If not, they retained a majority, but if not, there would have been parity in the House of Delegates in 2017. But not to worry, by the time we got to 2019, this is what had happened. 45 Republicans and 55 Democrats. That is a sea change in the composition of Republicans and Democrats in the Virginia House of Delegates. Now, here's the point. All of these incumbent Republicans that were defeated in 2017 and in 2019, and you'll see from this chart, again from our friends at VPAP, 12 incumbent Republicans lost their seats in 2017, another 4 in 2019, 16 seats changed hands between those two elections. Every single one of those losses, or almost every single one of those losses, came in Northern Virginia and the Richmond area suburbs due to these significant changes in residential mobility and voting patterns that we talked about before. Here's a visual that shows that. At the top, if you look at Democratic seats in the House of Delegates in Northern Virginia in 2015 compared to 2019, you will see how dramatic the Democratic strength in Northern Virginia grew in places like Prince William County and Loudoun County in particular. And likewise, in the Metro Richmond area, you'll see that areas here in Western Henrico and in Northern Chesterfield that had historically been Republican switched. And now all of a sudden we're voting Democratic. In fact, almost all of the Democratic gains in the General Assembly in the last two election cycles have occurred in Northern Virginia and in the suburbs in and around Richmond. In Northern Virginia, almost every single one of these seats are now held by Democrats in both the state Senate and in the House of Delegates, not by Republicans. Again, a sea change that has taken place due to the way in which voters are voting in these key regions of the state that are becoming more and more influential because of their population gains. Let me suggest a second reason that we have seen these changes over the course of the past decade. The second reason is this: the Republican Party has changed, but not necessarily for the better. Now, I know some of my Republican friends may take exception with what I'm about to say, and all I could ask is that you just think about it objectively in light of the facts, which I think are fairly inescapable. Over the past decade, due to the influence of the Tea Party and the Trump movement, the Republican Party has moved farther to the right, both in policy and style, while Virginia has moved closer to the center because of these populations and demographic changes. In reality, the Republican Party has gone in one direction, while Virginia has been going in another direction. And that has made it more difficult for Republican candidates to connect with the voters in these rapidly growing urban and suburban centers across the state that, like it or not, are determining the outcome of these statewide political campaigns. The Republican Party has, let's be honest, become more ideologically rigid. It's become more anti-government. It's become more focused on issues and candidate styles that have driven voters away from the party and not drawn them into the party. One of the fundamental things that one learns in politics early on, or at least successful politics, is that successful politics is about addition and multiplication. It's not about subtraction and division. And when a party is going in one direction, when the voters are going in another direction, it creates a discontent and a disconnect that will show up at the polls on election day. And it surely has over the course of the past few election cycles here in Virginia. Let me suggest a third reason that we have seen these outcomes. There are other ways in which the Republican Party needs to change, but it has failed to change. The inescapable fact is that in the past 10 to 20 years, Virginia has become a much more diverse state, but the Republican Party has remained a fairly monolithic political party. The Republican Party has not changed to reflect or embrace what I call the changing face of Virginia. And most of this changing face of Virginia happens to be taking place in these very urban and suburban centers that I talked about before as a result of these changes in residential mobility patterns. Let's look at some numbers. If you look at census data from 2000 and 2010 and the projections from 2020, this is what you see. Over the course of the past 20 years in Virginia, the white population has declined by 8%. The Black population has declined by 5%. But look at the significant growth that the Hispanic and Asian populations have seen in Virginia. Growth of 85% in the Hispanic population and 72% in the Asian population. This is the changing face of Virginia. And the Republican Party has failed to respond. It's failed to connect with this changing face of Virginia. If this chart doesn't give you the willies, if you happen to be a Republican, I don't know what will. The two fastest growing demographic groups in Virginia are Hispanic and Asian, but look at how they're voting. They're voting 65% for Democrats and less than 30% for Republicans. You see how these things start adding up? Do you see how these layers start building one on top of the other? Republicans are losing by more than a 2-to-1 margin the two fastest growing demographic groups in the state. By the way, I could sneak another demographic group in there and make the same point, and that happens to be younger voters. It happens to be millennials, and it happens to be Generation Z, where Republicans are losing them by these same types of margins. We could even throw in suburban women that Republicans are also now losing by disproportionate numbers compared to where they were just a few years ago. Republicans have to figure out, if they want to be competitive in top of the ticket statewide political campaigns in Virginia, how can we connect with these voters in these growing urban and suburban centers? How can we in particular connect with these voters that represent the changing face of Virginia? Now, if you don't think that's true, let me give you another example. This is what the Republican minority in the Virginia General Assembly looked like in 1993 versus what the Republican minority in the current General Assembly looks like as of 2020. And you will see that in 1993, the Republican caucus in the Virginia House of Delegates was dominated mostly by white males. There were only 3 white females. Today, little has changed. The Republican caucus in the House of Delegates is still dominated mostly by white men. There are a couple more white women, but there's not a lot of diversity represented in that caucus. On the other hand, look at what's happened to the Democratic caucus in the Virginia House of Delegates during the same period of time. In 1993, mostly white men made up the Democratic caucus in the House of Delegates. There were some white women, some African-American men, some African-American women, but look at the diversity in that caucus, that Democratic caucus in the House of Delegates in 2020. It represents the changing face of Virginia. And if Republicans want to be competitive in these top of the ticket statewide campaigns, but more and more in congressional and legislative districts as well, they have to figure out, how do we embrace, how do we reflect, how do we represent that changing face of Virginia? Democrats have adjusted to the changing face of Virginia. Republicans have not. And it is a third reason why we have seen these challenges for the Republican Party in Virginia over the course of the past decade or so. Let me close by talking about one other factor that I think has been a part of this. And I do this with, some realization that many of my Republican friends will probably take great offense, but, facts are what they are, and this one can't be overlooked. Trump happened. Now, I understand Republicans love Donald Trump. And if you look at the data, over 90% of Republicans loved Donald Trump. Over 60% of Republicans want Donald Trump to be the Republican nominee again in 2024. But look, nobody else loved Donald Trump, at least not here in Virginia. Maybe in some places, maybe in West Virginia, where Donald Trump's approval rating was 65%, but not here in Virginia. And, the truth is there aren't enough Republicans in Virginia to elect anybody to anything these days. To win in Virginia, Republicans have to be able to appeal to these more moderate and independent voters, more conservative Democrats, and this changing face of Virginia that we've talked a lot about in the second part of this lecture tonight. Relying solely on Republican voters, no matter how passionate they are, is not a formula for victory in today's Virginia. Let me share some statistics. In 2009, the voter turnout in the governor's race in Virginia was 40%. In 2017, it was 48%. In 2010, voter turnout in congressional midterms was 44%. By 2018, it had grown to 60%. And in Virginia legislative races in 2011, voter turnout was 29%, but in 2019, it was 43%. Significant increases in the number of Virginians that were going to the polls to vote in every election year following the presidential election of 2016. So the question is, what was it that was driving these voters to the polls? What was it that was driving these record voter turnouts in these elections in 2017, 2018, and 2019? Well, if you look at the way that people voted, it was clear that they were being driven to the polls not because of their support for President Trump, but because of their opposition to President Trump. In 2017, when Ralph Northam was elected governor, President Trump's approval rating in Virginia was 39%. In 2018, when many of these new Democrats were elected to Congress in places like the 2nd District and the 7th District and the 10th District, President Trump's approval rating was 40%. And in 2019, when Democrats took control of the Virginia House of Delegates, President Trump's approval rating was 36%. Many more people were going to the polls to vote in 2017, 2018, and 2019, but they weren't going to the polls to vote for President Trump. They were going to the polls to vote against President Trump. These are negative coattails that the president had on political campaigns in Virginia in 2017, 2018, and 2019. The numbers are simply inescapable. Let me give you a couple more examples of that, and then we'll wrap up. One is the Trump example itself. In 2016, President Trump received 44% of the popular vote in Virginia. Hillary Clinton got 50% of the popular vote in Virginia. In 2020, President Trump got the same 44% of the popular vote. Joe Biden got 54% of the popular vote in Virginia. Here's the thing I want you to get. No Republican had received less than 44% of the vote in Virginia since Thomas Dewey in, ironically, 1944. There were a couple exceptions. I note there in 1948, Dewey got 41% of the vote, but that's because Strom Thurmond got 10% of the vote. In 1968, Richard Nixon got 43% of the vote, but that's because George Wallace got 24% of the vote. The point is that if you are a Republican in Virginia running for president, you only get 44% of the vote. That is an historic all-time low. President Trump simply wasn't popular in Virginia, and in particular, he wasn't popular in these urban and suburban centers that we have talked about that are representing more and more of the state's population. And then the last example I will give of this fact is what I call the Gillespie example. In 2014, Ed Gillespie came within 17,000 votes of defeating Mark Warner for a U.S. Senate seat. 49.6% of the popular vote went to Gillespie. No one thought Gillespie would come that close to Warner, but he did. People were willing to vote for a candidate like Ed Gillespie, even against a very popular Democratic senator and former governor in Mark Warner. But in 2017, the same Ed Gillespie lost the Virginia governor's race by almost 250,000 votes, defeated by a relatively unknown Democrat, Ralph Northam, who was not that popular, not seen as that strong of a candidate at the time. Yet Northam defeated Gillespie by a margin of 55 to 45%. One of Ed Gillespie's campaign strategists later attributed that defeat in 2017 to Ed Gillespie being, quote, run over by the Trump train. The negative coattails that President Trump had in Virginia in 2017, 2018, and 2019 clearly worked to the disadvantage of Republicans, and it worked to the advantage of Democrats. So look, all of this leaves us with the question, is Virginia still a competitive two-party state, or has it gone from blue to red and back to blue? Is there anything that Republicans can do to get back in the game, or is it a cause that is lost? Well, are we still a competitive two-party state? Let's revisit. Let's revisit what happened from 1992 to 2010, this decade of Republican dominance, versus what has happened since 2010, this decade of Democratic dominance. And you can see the numbers depicted on the slide there before you. Clearly, the pendulum has swung. Clearly, Virginia has gone from being a blue state to a red state and back to being a blue state, particularly in these top-of-the-ticket statewide campaigns, but increasingly so in legislative and congressional district campaigns as well. So are we still a competitive two-party state? Is Virginia still a competitive two-party state? My answer to that question is no, it's not. It is right now a state that is being dominated by Democrats because of all of these factors that we have talked about tonight. Perhaps the better question is this one. Can Virginia become a competitive two-party state again? And I think the answer to that is it depends. It depends in large part on decisions that the Republican Party makes about the kind of candidates that it nominates, about the kind of campaigns that it runs, about its ability to reach out to the changing face of Virginia, reconnect with the voters in these major urban and suburban centers. One thing is clear, if the Republican Party keeps doing what it's been doing, if it keeps behaving as it's been behaving, it will keep getting what it's been getting, and that is beaten and beaten badly at the polls. But if the party is smart enough and wise enough and determined enough to change, then perhaps Virginia can become a competitive two-party state again. To make that happen, there are some things I think Republicans have to do. They have to move away from being seen as a far-right, anti-government, ideologically rigid, mean-spirited party. They must become a more center-right party and a party more focused on reaching out to these groups that we've talked about, the changing face of Virginia, Hispanic and Asian voters, suburban women, and young people. That will not be an easy task, but it's going to happen if we are to remain or become again a competitive two-party state. I would emphasize this, Mountain Valley Republicans demonstrated it. It doesn't mean that Republicans have to abandon their principles. Conservatives can win in Virginia. But it does mean that Republicans have to do a better job relating their principles to issues that Virginia families care about, have to present themselves in a more mainstream, responsible manner, and they have to adopt specific policies and strategies to reach out and connect with these groups, suburban women, young people, Hispanic and Asian voters, particularly in these urban and suburban centers that have been going against them and against them and against them for the past decade or more. I will close with simply this thought. Whether you are a Republican or a Democrat, we should all want a healthy, competitive two-party political system in Virginia. When we have a healthy, competitive, two-party political system, it involves more people in the process of democracy. It helps stabilize the democratic process, and it will ultimately drive policy to the center, which is where most people think it should be. Single party control does tend to drive policy to the far right or the far left. Most people don't live on the right extreme or the left extreme. They live kind of in the mainstream. And that's where they want policy to be. That only happens if we have a competitive, healthy, two-party political system. Well, I know that's a lot to digest and a lot to think about over the course of the past hour. I hope you found it somewhat informative and hopefully provocative. Hopefully giving you some things to think about as you think about the current state of Virginia politics from blue to red and back again. So I'm going to go into the question and answer queue here. And we got about 20 or 25 minutes. So I'm going to kind of go through as many of the questions that have come in as I can during that period of time. And again, I encourage you, feel free to reach out to me at wbolling@gmu.com or .edu, wbolling@gmu.edu. Share with me your thoughts on tonight's lecture. Please don't feel free that you got to agree with everything I've said. Feel free to challenge me if you think I deserve to be challenged on anything we've talked about tonight, or if there are some questions that you asked that I don't get to. Feel free to write me and I'll try to respond to them as well. So I'm going to open up the question and answer queue, and I'm just going to go through. We got about 27 questions on here. I will not get through them all, but I'm going to go through a few of them. I'm going to start with this one down here that picks up on something I just talked a little bit about. Says, aren't these Mountain Valley Republicans the same thing as early Democrats? Plus, you mentioned the Byrd machine, Jim Crow policies, but today's Republicans seem to want to restrict voting. So I think I kind of get where that question is coming from. I would say this: no, Mountain Valley Republicans are not the same thing as early Democrats. There probably were similarities. They were fiscal conservatives, and some of those early Democrats were fiscal conservatives. But they were great champions of what we today might call social justice in their time. In fact, they pushed back very strongly against the segregationist policies of the Byrd machine. No, I think there were marked differences between the Mountain Valley Republicans and the Democrats of the old Byrd machine. The second part of that question, where'd it go? Oh, it's disappeared on me. Okay, I lost the second part of it, so I apologize for that. But I think they were very different. And the Mountain Valley Republicans, again, I think are a good model of where the Republican Party probably needs to be today, as opposed to maybe where it is today. And there's a couple other questions that dealt with kind of like that same topic. There's a question that said, today's Republicans need to learn and understand what it means to be a Mountain Valley Republican. And, I think that's probably true. Here's a question about redistricting. Do you think the new form of redistricting will be good or bad for Republicans? Hopefully it will be indifferent to Republicans and Democrats. I mean, the whole purpose of moving to a more bipartisan approach or nonpartisan approach to redistricting is that it moves us away from, or at least as far away from, political gerrymandering as we can get. So hopefully it'll be a process that draws congressional and legislative district boundary lines without regard to political party or political influence. And hopefully it'll be a process that gets us back to doing redistricting the way the Constitution of Virginia says it should be done. The Constitution of Virginia says redistricting should create districts that are compact, districts that are contiguous, districts that have some common interest. So hopefully it will be a process that gets us back to that. I think this new redistricting process could be better than what we've had in the past, but it is not perfect. It was a product of a legislative compromise. For me, there's still too many legislators involved in that redistricting panel. So we'll have to see how it works out. I think it's got great potential, But we'll see whether it works out the way that maybe we those of us who supported it and felt passionately about it believed it would work out or not. I think time will tell, but hopefully it will be indifferent to helping Republicans or helping Democrats. Here's a question that says, why is it that many Republicans of today continue to deny the party's modern growth came from segregationist Democrats? I think probably what that question is getting at is that when many of the old Byrd Democrats left the Democratic Party, they went to the Republican Party. But I think it is incorrect to draw or infer from that the Republican Party of today is a segregationist party. I don't believe that to be the case at all. But I do think that there's more that Republicans can do to address issues with respect to issues of racial justice that we talk so much about today. There are ways that the Republican Party can more aggressively engage in a discussion of those issues, and frankly, do a better job engaging in the issues that matter most to the Black community in Virginia today, most of which unfortunately don't get debated. The real issues that need to be debated don't get debated. I think there's an opportunity for Republicans to be champions of that. But I also think there are ways that Republicans can develop and pursue policies that do a better job reaching out to these other groups that they struggle with, suburban women and young people and Hispanic and Asian voters. Republicans need to come up with strategies that reach out to those groups. And look, I think there's a really good model for what Republicans have to do to win in Virginia. And the model is the type of campaign that Bob McDonnell and I ran in 2009. I mean, we were two pretty conservative guys. I mean, if you remember at the time, the rub against us was that we were too conservative. Now, all of a sudden, I spent my entire political career being too conservative, and now all of a sudden I'm a squishy, moderate rhino wimp. But in truth, I haven't changed. I'm still a pretty conservative guy, but we were conservative guys who ran a campaign that talked about education and transportation and healthcare and public safety, these kitchen table issues, much like the Mountain Valley Republicans did, that enabled us to win in places like Fairfax, Loudoun, and Prince William, and win big in places like Henrico, Chesterfield, Virginia Beach, and Chesapeake. So, these are, there are models out there of what Republicans need to do. The question is, are Republicans willing to do what they need to do in order to re-engage and to become more competitive with this changing face of Virginia? And we'll see over time. Up until now, the answer to that's been no. They haven't been willing to do what they need to do. At some point in time, Republicans may get tired of losing. And at some point in time, if they get tired of losing, they may go back to the more pragmatic approaches of these Mountain Valley Republicans that really ushered in that more competitive age of Republicans in statewide politics back in the 1970s. Let's see, what else do we have here in the question queue? Let me go down and look at. Whoops, sorry about that. Go down and look at a couple more. Oh, it was someone, Steve Tonley. Thank you, Steve. It wasn't Dillinger, it was Willie Sutton about robbing banks. Thanks for correcting me. I was surprised my wife didn't correct me on that. Wes asked this question: do you think Larry Hogan and Charlie Baker are models we should embrace with respect to maybe Republican politics in Virginia? Yeah, I think the answer to that is yes. Larry Hogan is probably regarded as a more moderate Republican. Charlie Baker certainly regarded as a more moderate Republican, but that's the kind of Republican it took to win in places like Maryland and Massachusetts. And, Republicans need to figure out what type of a Republican and what type of a campaign does it take to win in Virginia. What the Republican Party has been doing has not been working, and it's not going to work in Virginia. So I think the Republican Party is going to have to come up with a different strategy. And that's all about nominating candidates who can connect with these voters in these urban and suburban centers. And it's all about running campaigns that can connect with voters in these urban and suburban centers. And I would emphasize again, it doesn't mean you have to abandon your conservative principles. You can still stand up for conservative principles and govern in a conservative way, but you have to have candidates and you have to run campaigns that attract people. And you can't nominate candidates and run campaigns that drive people away. Let's see, what else do we have here? Is there any prospect for a compromise for Nova, Northern Virginia, to be brought into a future DC state? Yeah, that's probably driven more by that argument that we need to separate Nova from Rova, right? I hear that a lot. People say, we just need to get rid of Northern Virginia. The rest of Virginia would be fine. Look, that's not going to happen, and it shouldn't happen. I mean, the fact of the matter is, like it or not, Northern Virginia is the economic engine of our state. If Northern Virginia broke off tomorrow and became its own state, the economy of the rest of Virginia would take us from the top of economic performance to almost the bottom of economic performance. The answer isn't how do we divide Virginia. The answer is, the question is, how do we unite Virginia, and how do Republicans do a better job reaching out and connecting, not just with people who live in rural parts of the state, but also with people who live in these more urban and suburban centers. Virginia is in large part today what it is because of the tremendous influence in a positive way that Northern Virginia's had on our state economically and culturally. If you're a Republican, you may not think folks in Northern Virginia vote the way you want them to. I get that, but they voted the way you wanted them to in 2009. When you offered up to them candidates and campaigns that they could connect with, they responded to that. I think that can happen again. It may not happen overnight, but there's not an ounce within me that believes that Republicans can't be competitive again in Northern Virginia with the right kind of candidates and the right kind of campaigns. And look, Republicans don't have to win in Northern Virginia. Now, Bob McDonnell and I won Fairfax, Loudoun, Prince William, but you don't have to win, but you can't be crushed in Northern Virginia, right? You got to at least be competitive. And that can happen if Republicans nominate the right kind of candidates and the right kind of and run the right kind of campaigns. Wes asks, what are your predictions for the statewide races and the House races this year? Yeah, good question. Statewide races, I think my answer to that is it depends on who Republicans nominate and what kind of candidate they put forward and what type of campaign they run. I think if you look at the current field of Republican candidates for governor, there are a couple candidates in that field that, and this is just a Bill opinion, there are a couple candidates in that field that I think could be very strong contenders. If the polling data is accurate, it looks like Terry McAuliffe will be the Democratic nominee. He's probably going to win that primary by a wide margin. He will be a formidable opponent for Democrats. And a lot of my Republican friends I know don't like former Governor McAuliffe, but the fact is he left office with an approval rating well into the 50s. And, he's a tireless campaigner. He can raise a lot of money. Don't think for a minute that he will not be a very formidable candidate for Democrats in November. But there are a couple of the Republicans that I think could make it a competitive race. I'm certainly not in the business these days of endorsing candidates, but a candidate like Kirk Cox, I think, could be a very credible candidate for Republicans. He's got significant experience in the Virginia House of Delegates. He probably understands state government better than anybody that's running on either side of the political aisle this year. Got a good personal story as a former teacher and a coach. I'm very intrigued by the candidacy of Glenn Youngkin. I think this is a guy who's been a very successful international business leader. has the ability to self-fund a large part of his campaign. I've been really impressed with the, frankly, campaign that he's run for the Republican nominating process. So, I think candidates like Youngkin or Cox could make it a competitive race in November. And right now, I think that the lay of the land favors Democrats, but I would say two things. Number one, there's a lot that could happen between now and November on the national stage that could give Democrats the wind blowing in their face as opposed to the wind being at their back. That could certainly change over the course of the next several months. And I do think passion right now is higher on the Republican side. Republicans may be tired of losing, may really be fired up for the November campaign. Democrats, on the other hand, may be a little complacent because they've had so many victories lately. So, look, there's a reason why they play the game, right? On any given day, depending on how things evolve, things can change. So if Republicans are smart and nominate the right kind of a candidate, and if that candidate is smart and runs the right kind of a campaign that is targeted toward reconnecting with voters in these major urban and suburban centers, focusing on suburban women, young people, Hispanic, Asian voters, I think it's a race that could be in play. And the House races, the same thing. There are a lot of those seats that Republicans lost in 2017 and 2019 that under the right circumstances, less Democratic energy, that Republicans might be able to win back. So, I think there's an opportunity for the GOP to get back in the game in the fall of 2021. And, we'll just have to see over the course of the next several months whether they learn from the lessons of the past or not. Someone did ask a question here. Steve asked a question about Amanda Chase, being the GOP leading candidate for governor. I don't think she is the GOP leading candidate for governor. I do not think that Amanda Chase will win the Republican nomination. I think it will go to someone else. She will have a base of support, but in this unassembled convention that Democrats are having, or Republicans are having, you have to have at least 50.1% of the vote, a majority of the vote to win. And look, let's be honest, one of the reasons that, and there's a question on here from Carlos about the convention primary thing. I mean, one of the reasons that the State Central Committee of the Republican Party of Virginia did not want a primary is because a candidate like Amanda Chase may have been able to win in a primary with a plurality of the vote. That will not happen in an unassembled convention. You got to get to 50.1%. And, I just don't think she can get there. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think she can get there. I think it will be one of these other candidates, a Kirk Cox, a Glenn Youngkin, Pete Snyder could be in play as well. But I don't think that Chase will be the Republican nominee. I think the unanswered question to watch is if Chase is not the Republican nominee, what does she do? Does she accept defeat and move on, or does she, as she has threatened to do on a number of occasions, run as an independent? And if she runs as an independent, then of course the game is over. It's checkmate at that point for the Democrats. But hopefully that won't happen. Hopefully we'll have two really strong candidates talking about issues that matter in November, and then the voters will have to decide what direction they want the Commonwealth to go the way it's been going the last couple of years, or has it gone too far? And do they want to kind of bring it back again and restore some balance? I think that'll be the question. Let's see, what else do we have? We'll take a couple more and then we'll wrap up. Let's see, what type of issues, good question, could Virginia Republicans champion that would potentially differentiate themselves from the Trump image that is so toxic in the Commonwealth? Well, I think, I would answer that question this way. Republicans need to go back and look at that campaign of 2009. Look at what Bob McDonnell and I talked about. We talked about economic development. We talked about the economy, creating jobs. We talked about improving educational opportunities and healthcare and transportation, public safety. Those are the kind of issues that these voters care about and that the Republicans need to be championing. But I would also say that, Democrats have created some openings for Republicans. I think this, there is just a mess going on right now with the Virginia Parole Board. I think that gives Republicans a great issue to talk about. There were some reports out last week that the Northam administration has tried to very quickly kind of pull back from about discontinuing advanced math classes until the 11th and 12th grades. That's the kind of an issue that I think Republicans could really jump on and draw some distinctions on. And look, I mean, the truth is that the Governor Northam and the General Assembly in the last couple of years have pursued the most liberal policy agenda in the history of the state. And some people think that's a good thing, but a lot of people don't think it's a good thing. So I think that gives Republicans an opportunity to say, this has just gone too far. We need to restore some balance. There needs to be a check on this. And if Democrats overreach at the federal level, which they're fully capable of doing between now and November, Republicans may have an opportunity there to paint some of these Democratic policies as being too extreme and restoring some modernity to state government. So, there are issues, and there are, if this were a football game and you were looking for holes in the line that you could run through, Democrats have served up a couple issues here of late to Republicans that they may be able to capitalize on. And one last question I'll do here, and it deals with Chuck Todd put up a recent poll showing nationally that President Biden has a 54% approval rating. And the poll then asked an open-ended question, do you approve of? And the number one answer was not Trump. Okay, I get the point. Look, presidents have coattails. And sometimes the coattails that presidents have are positive, and sometimes the coattails that presidents have are negative. One of the things that some of the numbers that we looked at tonight, I think make pretty clear that at least in Virginia, now, maybe not in some other states, but at least in Virginia, Trump's coattails were really negative for the Republican Party in Virginia in 2017, 2018, and 2019. The question is, will Biden's coattails come November be positive or negative in the election of 2021? Right now, a 54% approval rating is pretty good for President Biden, and I think that's kind of the averages that I've seen on Real Clear Politics and places like that. If Biden's approval rating is still in the the mid 50s come November, that will be a plus for Democrats. But if it falls into the mid 40s, then it could have just the opposite impact for Democrats. So a lot can happen to a president's approval rating between now and November. I think the bigger question that Democrats in Virginia are going to really have to focus on is what can they do in an off-year election, 2021, to gin up the same type of energy that they had in 2017, 2018, 2019, and 2020. And can they do that? Will they be able to get voter turnout as high as they need it to be in these urban and suburban centers? Will they be able to get a Black voter turnout as high as they need it to be in these urban and suburban centers? Can they maintain that intensity level? I think the opportunities that Republicans have this year really come down to three things. Number one, do they nominate the right kind of a candidate who runs the right kind of a campaign? Number two, does the Biden administration get into trouble between now and November, creating maybe negative coattails for the Democratic nominee? And then number three, can the Democratic Party really maintain that same type of energy level that they had in 2017, 18, 19, and 20. You know, we'll see how it turns out. My hunch is that the best thing that Democrats had going for them in 2017, 2018, 2019, and 2020 is no longer there, and that was Donald Trump. Donald Trump certainly drove a lot of enthusiasm among Republicans, but make no mistake, he drove an incredible amount of enthusiasm among Democrats. Donald Trump is not there anymore. Can Democrats maintain that same level of enthusiasm? And that may create the greatest opening for Republicans in 2021. Well, look, it is 8:30, and we promised that we would adjourn this session tonight by 8:30. I apologize that I wasn't able to get through all of the questions, but again, you know, I invite you, if you have a comment you'd like to share or a question you'd like to ask, email me at wbowling@gmu.edu, and I'll be glad to respond to as many of those as I can. I want to thank again tonight the Schar School of Government and Policy and Government at George Mason University for sponsoring this virtual lecture. I will tell you, I've enjoyed the last 3 years of being able to teach Virginia's next generation of leaders at George Mason and VCU and University of Richmond more than anything that I have ever done. And the opportunity to share some thoughts with you all tonight. Whether you agree with them or disagree with them, you know, think about them. We can learn from each other. And I think that's what makes us all better citizens, and hopefully brings about a greater unity in our country and in our state, which is certainly something we could all benefit from. So I want to thank you for tuning in tonight and being a part of this virtual lecture. And I hope that we'll see you all again somewhere down the road. And with that, April, we'll go ahead and close down for tonight. Thanks again, everybody. Appreciate you joining us.